Hello everyone, welcome to Psychology 101, General Psychology, and today we're going to be talking about memory. So we've talked a little bit about learning. Now we need to figure out how can we use this information not only now but in the future. When we talk about memory, we're talking about the persistence of learning over time. How do we store this information and how are we able to retrieve this information in the future? We're pretty good at remembering things, yet there is some information that can slip through the cracks. So what are the ways in which we can use memory? Well, we can use it to recall things, so basically retrieve information that we've learned earlier. We can use it to recognize things, recognize stimuli in the environment, identifying previously learned items, for example. And we can use memory to relearn things, so maybe learning something quicker the second or third time we encounter it. So this is kind of the basis behind taking a final exam when you've already taken kind of mid-quarter exam that has already tested you of this material. You're trying to relearn that material for the final exam. We tend to be much better at recognition than recall. We tend to have a much easier time identifying things in the environment that we are familiar with rather than creating them out of nothing. So how does memory function? Well, first of all, we encode information. This is basically learning. So we're basically having it enter our brains in some way. Then we store the information. We find basically a location for it. It's not that simple, but find an area for it to basically allow us to retain that information in the brain. And then we use that information at some point in the future. We retrieve that information, bring the information back out of our brain, so to speak, for use. So that's how memory functions. We have lots of different types of memories that we can focus on. Sensory memory is this kind of immediate, brief recording of sensory information. Short-term memory focuses on activated memory, where we can hold a few items in our head. So when we need to remember a phone number, we can remember those digits in our head while doing other things. If we don't use that information quickly, we're probably going to forget it. And then anything that's in our short-term memory, if we really want to remember it, if we focus on rehearsing it, that can be transferred into our long-term memory. This is the permanent and relatively limitless storehouse of information that we hold. It includes knowledge, it includes all the information we have about skills and all of our experiences that we've had in our past. Another type of memory is known as working memory. It's basically a reimagining of short-term memory, but it's much more conscious and active, so we can process incoming auditory or visual spatial information, but we use this information in tandem with things we know from our long-term memory. So we can basically look at this information through the lens of the accumulated knowledge that we already have to maybe interpret it in a different way, or maybe to encode it in a manner that's much more effective for our brains. We can also have explicit and implicit memories, so these can be more effortful or automatic forms of processing our environment. So we may end up remembering how many times we've seen someone in a day, but we're not actively and consciously remembering that each time we have seen that person. So that's an example of implicit memory, whereas us intentionally paying attention to how many times we've seen this person is explicit memory. So how do we build memories? Well, we can build implicit memories through automatic processing. We generally do this through making associations between different stimuli. So we are pretty good at remembering where something was located that we saw earlier. We're pretty good at remembering when something happened earlier, or how often something has occurred, even though we may not be actively thinking about that when we encounter those stimuli in the environment. We're also really good at retaining procedural memory. So that's basically memories of how to perform different skills, such as riding a bike. Although we may be actively thinking about the specific movements we have when we're encoding this information, there are a lot of little things that we do, such as keeping our balance on a bike, that we're not actively thinking about at the time, but those are recorded in our implicit memories. Explicit memories and more effortful processing gets a little bit more complicated. So this is when we actively encode material or stimuli. So for example, studying your textbook to prepare for a test. Sometimes this type of processing can become automatic over time. So we may use more effortful processing to memorize different words of a language, but then after we use the words and the grammar and the language enough times, it becomes relatively automatic. So what are the different types of explicit memories we can have? Well, we can have sensory memory. It's going to be both iconic and echoic, so these kind of fleeting sensory images of things that you saw or things that you heard. Sensory memory doesn't last very long, a little bit longer for echoic memory than iconic memory. But we can use this information, as long as we do so quickly, to remember things that we may not have been paying extreme attention to at the time. Short-term working memory, the general rule is we are good at memorizing 7 plus or minus 2 digits, so a phone number would fit into that range, 6 letters or 5 words, and then if we use that information relatively soon, we can transfer it into long-term memory. Doesn't last long, it lasts longer than sensory memory, and the capacity that we have in our short-term memory differs by age. It oftentimes reflects our intellectual level, especially with working memory. But this is, again, how much information we can kind of remember in our heads before we rehearse it enough where it can lead to becoming a long-term memory. There are different strategies that we can use for explicit memories to help us remember things. So chunking is one example, kind of organizing groups into familiar units. Mnemonics using memory aids, so Kings play cards on fat green stools is an example of a mnemonic device that helps me remember the different categories of, so like kingdom, phylum, genus, species, all those different labels. That's an example. Hierarchies help us organize our memories. We do this not only with memories, but also organizing our environments, our social environment as well. Distributed practice is extremely helpful for retaining information long term. So for all of you studying material out there for your classes, follow what's known as the spacing effect. Try to, instead of cramming all information at once, space out the amount of times you try to remember or restudy information, that you are re-encoding information. Another great way to remember information long-term, transfer it from short-term memory into long-term memory, is through the testing effect. So practicing trying to retrieve this information in a practice exam, for example, can help you then retain it a little bit longer. Within explicit memories and effortful processing, we can have different levels of processing, so we can process information relatively shallowly. So the basic qualities or characteristics of information, so structure or appearance of words, whether or not words appeared. Or we can process things a little bit more deeper through semantic coding. So we can try and process the meaning of words, and that will help us then remember the definition of a word or the appearance of a word, rather than simply focusing on structure of a word. And deep processing is the best way to retain and be able to retrieve information in the future. Lastly, making the material personally meaningful is extremely effective way of being able to retrieve information in the future. Making things applicable to you kind of uses what's known as the self-reference effect. We're better at remembering information about ourselves, so if we can apply information that we want to remember to ourselves, that's also going to make it easier for us to remember. So what about storing information? We've encountered a stimulus in the environment. How do we store it? Well, we don't necessarily store information in specific areas of the brain like we would store a book in a library. We use multiple areas of the brain to store information and also to retrieve and encode information. We see that different types of memories are generally focused on different areas of the brain. So for example, explicit memories are focused on the frontal lobes and the hippocampus, whereas implicit memories are focused on the cerebellum and the basal ganglia. And there are a lot of ways that our memories can be influenced. So emotions can influence how we form memories, how we store memories. Emotions trigger stress hormones in our bodies. They activate the amygdala, and these can influence how we store memories. So, for example, we see something known as flashbulb memory, where extremely traumatic or shocking events we tend to remember very well. So, for example, all of you can probably remember where you were or what you were doing when you heard about the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center. The stress hormones that are kind of flush through our body when we encounter one of these events helps us remember a lot more information about that event, about that situation, than we otherwise would. So that's storage. What about retrieval? How do we retrieve information, and are we good at retrieving information? Well, it depends. We use cues in our environment to decide how and when we retrieve information. All of our memories are associated with other memories or other information in our brain, so activation of those other pieces of information can lead to activation of specific memories. So in that way, memories can be primed. So if we unconsciously present specific information, we can then activate specific memories. So if we prime words of elderly individuals, that might activate memories of our grandmother or grandfather, for example. Our ability to retrieve information can depend on the context. So interestingly, we generally see that we're better able to retrieve information within the context where we learned it. So it's good to learn information in the classroom in which you're going to take a test, or it's good to study in a classroom where you're going to take the test. Similarly, we see that we're better able to retrieve information in the same psychological state in which we learned it, or physical state for that matter. We see an interesting study that found that individuals who learned information underwater while scuba diving were better able to retrieve that information underwater compared to on land, and vice versa for information that they learned on land. So our psychological state, our physical states can influence how we're able to encode and retrieve information. And also, depending on the situation, we can be focused towards early or more recent information. So the recency effect is when we remember information that we just recently encountered. We tend to fall into the recency effect soon after encoding. So we've just encountered the information, we're more likely to remember that information. But we tend to remember information that we encountered first, the primacy effect, after it's been a long time since we encoded the information. And that's simply due to rehearsal. If we're trying to remember a long string of numbers, we're going to say that first number more times, or be able to retrieve that first number, because we're rehearsing it more often. So if we have like 1, 5, 7, 8, 9, if we say that over and over in our heads, we're going to remember that 1 more often than we're going to remember any digits in the middle, just because that's the thing that we're saying first. So sometimes we aren't able to retrieve information. Sometimes we forget. Oftentimes forgetting information is perceived as a negative, but considering all of the information that we perceive on a day-to-day basis, discarding useless information can be a blessing. Some individuals have a difficult time remembering more so than others, and some people can't even construct new memories. We see differences in anterograde and retrograde amnesia. So anterograde amnesia means we can recall things from the past, but we can't form new memories, whereas retrograde amnesia means we can't recall the past at all. So why do we forget? Well, sometimes we fail to encode information properly. Again, we can't possibly pay attention to everything in our environment, so maybe we just weren't paying attention to that piece of information. Sometimes we see what's known as storage decay. Sometimes memories fade if we don't use them or retrieve them frequently enough. And sometimes we just fail to retrieve information. Sometimes this is because we can't access the memories. So if you think of the tip of the tongue effect, it's right there, but you can't quite get the memory or get that piece of information out. Sometimes that memory is interfered with proactively. So learning from before is disrupting the recall of new information. Sometimes it's interfered retroactively. So new information has kind of interfered with stuff that we've already learned in the past. And sometimes we're motivated to forget information. Painful memories that maybe don't shine us in the best of lights. Sometimes we can forget that information in order to self-enhance, to make us feel better. And even if we are able to retrieve memories, sometimes those memories aren't very reliable. When we encode information, we are often constructing memories rather than simply encoding the memory exactly the way it is. Sometimes memories are influenced by ourselves and others. So eyewitness memory can be influenced by how a question is phrased. So rather than asking a question, for example, did the car crash into another car, or did the car bump into the other car? We tend to see people who were asked the question, did the car crash into the other car, state that there was more damage done to the car than people in the other condition. So we are influenced by how questions are asked to us. Sometimes we are asked to imagine a certain event occurring, and after the fact, we may remember that as something that actually did happen. And sometimes we see what's known as repressed memories, where we end up remembering events that didn't actually occur because of suggestions by therapists, for example. And these repressed memories often tend to be about very negative situations, such as physical or sexual abuse. Sometimes we have source amnesia. You can think of deja vu. I feel like I've seen this before, but I don't know where. That's an example of source amnesia. So we don't always remember where we've seen something, even though we might remember that we have seen it before. And kind of what I've talked about here in a couple different examples, we have real memories and sometimes we have false memories. And these unreal memories feel like real memories. So that can be kind of a worrisome thing if we want to be able to distinguish between true and false memories. And sometimes we fall into what's known as a hindsight bias. That's when we sometimes change what we believe in or modify our memories of the past to coincide with the present. So I may have changed my mind about how I believe about a certain political candidate, for example, but I might think back and think, well, I always thought this way about them. What are you talking about? Even though that may not be the case. I kind of change my memories of the past to make myself look better, to self-enhance. So that's all I have for today. Thank you for your time and attention, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.